Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Baker Institute. Today we are very happy to welcome Wei-Ming to the Institute and to Rice University. Wei-Ming Du's talk is the second of the East Asian lecture series this fall at the Baker Institute. Some of you have attended the other talks. The three talks in this series all focus on the important role that culture plays in economic and social change. Bob Kapp, president of the U.S.-China Business Council, spoke just this Thursday about the ways that foreign corporations influence Chinese society through their values and culture. Wei-Ming Du, professor of Chinese history and philosophy at Harvard and director of the Harvard Yenching Institute, will talk today about the relationship between Asian values and the economic crisis in Asia. Finally, Senior Minister Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, one of the most influential statesmen in Southeast Asia, will also talk about cultural values and the economic crisis in Asia. He will speak here under the aegis of the Baker Institute at Rice's Grand Hall on October 23rd on Asian Meltdown. We welcome you to attend these events. These talks are just a part of a major initiative by the Baker Institute's Transnational China Project to open up research and discussion on the ways that the radical economic changes in Asia are changing Chinese culture and values. Next March, we will be hosting a path-breaking major research conference bringing together scholars from the PRC, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the United States to find new ways to study the cultural foundations of property rights in Chinese societies. In future years, the Transnational China Project will continue to form new networks of scholars and practitioners studying these issues. We look forward to bringing them here to Houston to share their expertise with you. We also invite you to explore the multilingual website, which is rapidly becoming a visible archive of resources on these issues. We're very proud of this website. We've had over 11,000 visitors in the first months, and there are more than 18 megabytes of text and images. It's becoming a very valuable resource on the whole issue of Chinese culture and the Transnational China Project. It's now my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker. His biography is in your program. As you can see, it's a very rich biography. I will not repeat all of it. He was born in China, educated in Taiwan and North America, got his PhD at MA and PhD at Harvard University. He taught Chinese intellectual history at Princeton University and the University of California at Berkeley. He has also lectured on Confucian humanism at Peking University, Taiwan University, Chinese University in Hong Kong, and the University of Paris. He's the author of several books that are listed in your program. He's on the Committee of the Study of Religion at Harvard, a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and he assumed his tenure as the director of the Harvard Yenching Institute in January of 1996. His talk, Asian Values and the Asian Economic Crisis, a Confucianist Perspective. I must underscore that our speaker is the world authority on the study of Chinese values and Confucian ideals in the modern world. He is often called upon to travel far and wide. I believe you just have been in Seoul and Prague recently, to share his expertise on views of modern Confucianism. I want to thank our sponsors, the Ford Motor Company and PricewaterhouseCoopers, for making this project possible. And after our speaker concludes his remarks, he will open up the session to questions and answers from you in the audience. Please use the microphones that are available that will be brought to you so that we can have the questions recorded on our videotape. It's now my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Wei-Ming Du.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction Ambassador Dirigian. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm greatly pleased and honored to have this rare opportunity to share my thoughts at the Baker Institute for Public Health at Rice University. This is probably the third time I visit Rice. Every time it was both enjoyable in a personal sense, but also extremely educational. So I look forward to the exchange in the after my presentation. I'm particularly interested in the question of Asian values in the context of a project we've been pursuing with the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. The question is multiple modernities, looking at the world, especially the modernization process, not as a homogenizing and unilinear process, but as a process that can assume different cultural forms. And looking at the rise of the modern world, originated, of course, in Europe, not simply as one particular ideology that is going to overwhelm the world, but as opening up new possibilities from many parts of the world. This is the broader context of my presentation. I'm not an expert on economics. I'm certainly not an expert on the economic crisis, and I still very much puzzled by what actually happened. But I think you may have some questions and interesting observations made. But I'd like to present this in the broader context of Confucian humanism, and I hope that what I'm going to present is something that's very close to my heart, and hopefully it will be somewhat relevant to your own appreciation of some of these critical issues. In an attempt to reconsider modernity, both as a historical phenomena and as a conceptual framework, I'm particularly interested in three major issues. One is the question of traditions in the modernizing process. Rather than talking about from tradition to modernity, we're talking about the continuous presence of traditions in the modernizing process. In fact, I edited a book, Harvard University Press published it a couple of years ago, Confucian Traditions in East Asian Modernity, exploring the questions of economic culture and also moral education in Japan and the so-called four mini dragons, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. The related issue is the relevance of non-Western civilizations for the self-understanding of the modern West. And of course, then it's related to the question of the global significance of local knowledge. I'm quite aware of the fact that each of these issues is immensely complex, and the interaction among them layers the picture with all kinds of ambiguities, and with some of them we can say fruitful ambiguities. A discussion of them together will hopefully show new possibilities emerging in this creative confusion, I guess, and show that we are at a critical juncture to move beyond the various kinds of what I call outmoded dichotomies, the dichotomy of the West and the rest, even though one of my colleagues has developed that notion in terms of the coming clash of civilizations, or the dichotomy between the local and global, the dichotomy even between traditional and modern. The reason to transcend these dichotomies is simply to show that a world defined in terms of the globalizing process is infinitely much more complex, intriguing, and important to use new conceptual apparatuses for appreciating them. The advent of the global village, either as a virtual reality or as an authentic home, is by no means congenial to human flourishing. even though many of us believe that globalization is a form of integration. In fact, the world compressed into an interconnected ecological, financial, commercial, trading, and electronic system has never been so divided in wealth, influence, and power. Just give you one illustration why many of us have been wired and interconnected globally in a way that time and space no longer are important for our communication. It's instantaneous communication with colleagues in Beijing, Tokyo, or in Europe. 50% of the population in the world have never heard or used a telephone. And even in the city of New York, that a very large percentage of the people never crossed the bridge, the Brooklyn Bridge, from Brooklyn to Manhattan. And people in the same block, some people may fly over the world on a regular basis, but a very large percentage of them may have a totally different conception of time, space, or even interconnectedness. Never in world history has the contrast between the rich and poor, the dominant and marginalized, the articulate and silenced, the included and excluded, the informed and uninformed, and the connected and isolated being so markedly drawn. The rich, dominant, articulate, included, informed, and connected beneficiaries of the system form numerous transnational networks, of course, making distance and indeed ethnic boundary, cultural diversity, religious exclusivism, or national sovereignty inconsequential in their march towards interconnectedness and towards even domination. On the other hand, residents of the same block may have radically different access to information, ideas, tangible resources, such as money, and intangible goods, such as prestige. People of the same electoral district may subscribe to sharply conflicting political ideologies, social mores, and worldviews. They may also experience the basic categories of human experience, time and space, in even incommensurable ways. The severity of the contrast between the haves and have-nots at all levels of the human experience, from the individual to the family to society and nation, of course, can be very easily demonstrated by empirical hard data. If we focused our attention exclusively on the powerful so-called mega trends that have exerted shaping influence in the global community, especially since the end of the Second World War, such as science and technology, communication, trade, finance, entertainment, or travel, tourism, migration, and we have to add disease, has changed so much that the human condition is being structured to structured in ways by all these newly emerging global forces without any reference to our inherited historical and cultural praxis or theories. So the notion that we need to look at this whole situation from a futuristic point of view, because anything that we experience in the past is somewhat irrelevant. In fact, one of the most significant end of the century reflections of the 20th century is the acknowledgement that globalization does not mean homogenization, meaning that people become the same, and that modernization sometimes intensifies as well as lessens economic, political, social, cultural, and religious conflict in both inter and even intra-national contexts. And it is in this sense that when I was a graduate student in the 60s, the modernization theory just was in vogue. at Harvard, Taco Parsons with many of his associates, identified the modernizing process in terms of three inseparable dimensions: market economy, democratic polity, and individualism. And there was a very strong belief that the modernizing process is going to engulf the world. All the other differences, cultural differences, will become somewhat insignificant. That process is a homogenizing process. But I think now most of the people, even the most militant modernists, do not consider the globalization process as the most recent phase of modernization. Is a homogenizing process. And in the last 10 or 15 years, in particular, people become critically aware of the emergence of primordial ties as defining characteristics of the human condition. The so-called primordial ties, for the convenience, I want to specify ethnicity, language, gender, land, class, maybe even age, and religious faith. For a number of years, people in the West interested in the modernizing process believed these were the issues that the developing countries will have to face up to. But now we know the seriousness of ethnicity in defining the human condition right here in the United States. When I first came to the States for graduate work in the 60s, the ruling ideology, at least the aspiration of the whole society, was the melting pot. But now we know how serious ethnicity is if we do not deal with that issue efficiently and satisfactorily, as many colleagues in history and in political science have noted, including Arthur Celestine Jr., the United States may become disunited. Language. We used to associate that problem with India, South Asia, but now we know how serious language is in Canada or in Belgium. Many of you know one of the great universities in the Western Hemisphere was the Louvain, which was a French-speaking center of higher learning in Belgium. But now University of Louvain is forever split between the Flemish side and the French side. And the twin probably will never meet again. And I recently visited Barcelona and quite critically aware of the Catalonians, the whole question, not to mention the Basque and all kinds of issues. We're really talking about the core of Western civilization rather than developing societies. Of course, gender is a new awareness. In the early 1960s, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences sponsored a conference, then later published a special volume in the official journal called Daedalus, to the year 2000. We're talking about in the 1960s, 30 years ago. And this volume is going to be republished by MIT Press. But the people who actually contributed to the original volume, one of them is Daniel Bell. And he was asked, recently I asked him, he said, with any things that you failed to predict, you made a number of things correctly. There are two major areas. One is the environmental issues. They failed to predict, but people became aware of that issue in the late 1960s, especially in the 70s, after the astronaut showed the planet is such an interconnected lifeboat. But the other one is gender, the role of women in workplace, in defining basic human relationships at all levels, in redefining power and influence, and even the whole idea of self-understanding, human self-understanding. Land, related to the question of sovereignty, of course, in the Middle East, a major issue. But this is also an issue in Hawaii, the sovereignty movement, Hawaii, in Taiwan, many other developed societies. Class, the Marxist category may be outmoded, but if class is understood in terms of the North-South problem, rich and poor, and we used to divide the world in terms of the North and South. Now we know in every region there is a North and South question. In Europe, maybe Germany could be considered North, but Turkey would be considered South. In Italy, northern Italy is North, but In the southern part of Italy, maybe a very significant percentage of unemployment in the south. And even within, not just a region, within a nation, within a particular area, some people say within a university, there's a north and south problem, different senses of wealth or importance. And age, we used to consider 30 years as one generation. Then we know there's a generational gap in the period of 10 years. Now some people say there's a generational gap between seniors and freshmen. The siblings, the older and younger siblings may have different languages, different conceptions of the world. And we used to concern about interreligious conflict, the Muslims and the Christians, the Sikhs and the Hindus and so forth. Increasingly, we're aware of the intra-religious conflict, the Orthodox and the liberal. And this is not just in Judaism or Christianity, but also in Hinduism, in Muslim societies, in the Confucian world. So primordial ties are powerful forces in constructing internally defensive cultural identities and externally aggressive religious exclusivities, compels practical-minded global thinkers to develop new conceptual resources to understand the spirit of our time. The common practice of internationalists, including some of the most sophisticated analyzers of the global scene, to condemn the enduring strength of primordial ties as parochial reflection or reaction to the inevitable process of globalization. I think it's simple-minded and even ill-advised. We really do not have a choice. It's not a choice of cosmopolitanism, globalization on the one hand, and local concerns, parochial concerns on the other. We have to think not in terms of either or. We have to think in terms of both and. How can we be global at the same time local? In fact, nowadays we are confronted with two conflicting and even contradictory forces in the global community. Internationalization or globalization and localization, people say communization, some people even say tribalization, tribal in the neutral sense. And of course, some people know I've been working with the United Nations from time to time. Actually, I was one of their guests to the Social Summit in Copenhagen in 1995. The United Nations, which came into being because of the spirit of internationalization, must now deal with complicated issues of local, ethnic, religious concerns. So it's not possible for anyone related, associated with the United Nations, not to have the sensitivity to specific local conditions. There's no way that we can imagine that we can deal with global issues without special attention to the particular specific conditions of the various kinds of local areas. It is in this context that I would like to raise the question about the significance of what I would call East Asian form of modernity for our understanding of the complexity of the relationship between globalization on the one hand and localization on the other. The first question we need to ask before we even get into the whole question about Asian values and so forth is whether there is a form of modernity, we call it East Asian, which is deeply under the influence of the West, no question about it, and yet significantly different. We know that East Asian intellectuals have been devoted students of Western learning for more than 100 years. If you look at the Japanese case, Dutch learning, and British learning, French learning, German learning, and recent decades, American learning. While they've been devoted students of Western learning, they haven't really abandoned their own cultural roots, whether in the Shinto tradition or Mahayana Buddhist tradition or Confucian tradition. And therefore, they can mobilize their own indigenous resources both as a way of responding to the challenges of westernization, later understood as modernization, but more recently globalization. And yet they tap their own cultural resources and try to develop certain kind of mixture. And people begin to realize in the West itself, the modernizing process, in fact, is a highly complex process of divergence as well. Take the example of democracy, the democratization process. The British experience is very different from the French. The French different from the German, and all of them very different from the American. The British emphasis, especially we talk about the Scottish Enlightenment, on gradualism, empiricism, some skepticism, was very sharply contrasted with the French experience of the revolutionary spirit. That's why you have Edmund Burke's reflection on the French Revolution, but also the obsession with the religious problem, religious question in the French experience. Whereas the Germans tried to catch up with both England and France, and German democratization was intertwined with a sense of ethnic pride and a sense of nationalism or patriotism. I was in Europe in 1989, attending a meeting called the Civil Society in the Modern West. The consensus of the European intellectuals, British, French, German, and so forth, was that the real full-fledged civil society only existed in America, not in Germany or France or even England. And Tocqueville, when he visited the United States, was overwhelmed by the incredible dynamism of American society, especially when the French aristocratic member of the aristocratic family observed the American elections and the powerful presentation of American women in the election. He was just overwhelmed and very much moved by that, and also felt there's something that Europe never had. So the vibrant civil society was unique to American experience. Of course, now we know that civil society is critical for any flourishing democracies. Look at the Central Asian situation, Central European situation, and Eastern European countries as well. It is in this connection, if indeed experience of modernization, taking the case of democracy as an example, was a highly varied and complex process, the situation in East Asia, of course, was equally complex. So it's not at all impossible to imagine a form of modernity which is East Asian, deeply under the influence of the West, and yet significantly different. If we assume there's an East Asian modernity, what does it mean? Earlier, I think there was a wrong interpretation, and that's the reason why the background of the Asian values. The wrong interpretation was characterized as reverse convergence. The earlier argument about modernization and westernization is that all the other societies would converge with the West. That we now know is probably simple-minded understanding of the complex of the process. Then in the late 70s, especially in the 80s, there was a kind of euphoria in East Asia, talking about reconvergence, meaning that the Western model was no longer the best model. There's East Asian model, and the East Asian model will be the model for the future. So the strength of influence shifted from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. Therefore, the great deal of talk about Asian values. I think the senior minister from Singapore he's one of the persons instrumental in developing this idea together with Mahathir of Malaysia and some Japanese, like Shintaro, some Japanese politicians. But I think, frankly, it was ill-conceived. It's probably even erroneous. Well, it's not a question of convergence. In fact, what actually happened in East Asia is an indication that a modernizing process can assume different cultural forms. So if indeed there's been an East Asian modernity, form of modernity, we're talking about Japan and 4 mini dragons, it's difficult to argue by any criteria that Japan is not modern, or for that matter, Singapore is not modern, or Taiwan and South Korea is not modern. It's difficult to do that. Of course, these are modern societies, but they're very different. But the message is not the reconvergence, not the reverse convergence. The message is from one to many, or one to at least several. In other words, the modernizing process is not just westernization. Even though it originated in the West, it will probably forever have certain kind of Western imprimatur, and yet assume different forms in Japan, in South Korea, in Singapore. And which means the possibility of a Southeast Asian modernity, or South Asian modernity, or Latin American modernity, maybe an African modernity. At least the implications that the modernizing process can have different forms. Just because originally, when the modernizing process occurred, first in the Enlightenment of the 18th century, and later, already it was not as simply a process of homogenization, but a process of divergence, of difference, of complexification. Therefore, the French model, the British model, the German model, the American model, even though they share many, many basic features, they're different. So the process is a process that have some distinctive features. That, for example, it's almost impossible to imagine you can have modernity or form of modernity without market economy. Difficult to imagine as a sustainable form of political system which could be considered modern, and it's not democratic. And it's difficult to imagine that a modern society that does not respect the dignity of the individual, does not respect human rights, does not respect some individual personal expressions, or the freedom of religion. You know, some of these features are universalizable. And yet, each form of modernity is linked to a particular cultural style or cultural tradition. So there is both divergence and convergence. It is in this context I'm trying to suggest there is a form of East Asian modernity. And this East Asian modernity has been under the influence of East Asian cultures. And East Asian culture is very complicated. There's a Taoist culture, there's Mahayana Buddhist culture, the Shinto culture, shamanistic culture in Korea, folk traditions, all kinds. But there's also Confucianism. That's the area I want to stress. And people try to characterize in terms of cultural patterns, very broadly generalization, sometimes crude, gross generalization, about the Confucian world. The Japanese talked about it, of course, the Koreans, and now increasingly Chinese. And what does it mean? It suggests that East Asia, both socialist East Asia and industrial East Asia, share a cultural heritage among all kinds of other cultural heritages. When I say industrial East Asia, I already pointed out Japan and 4 mini dragons. Socialist East Asia will include mainland China, Vietnam, for not ethnic reasons, but for cultural reasons, and also North Korea. I want to introduce an author, well, a hero of mine, I guess, Ambassador Edwin Reichelt, who was actually my predecessor. He was the director of the Harvard Engine Institute before he was called by President Kennedy to be the American ambassador to Japan. He's one of the leading scholars in the 70s of Japanese studies, but also Chinese studies as well. In 1974, he published an article in Foreign Affairs. And the article actually was based upon a talk to a trilateral commission that he did maybe in the previous year. It's called The Sinic World in Perspective, S-I-N-I-C, the Sinic World, meaning the Chinese world in perspective. At the time, a lot of people talk about Japanese exceptionalism. Japan was able to compete effectively, especially in manufacturing industries with America. People were overwhelmed how Japan, we used to believe that Japanese produced a lot of cheap goods. But then in the 70s, we realized Japan was able to compete effectively with virtually all major industries in shipbuilding, in steel, automobile, and so forth. People were really overwhelmed by the power of Japan. And so they talk about Japanese exceptionalism because Japan, as many of you know, began its modernizing process by a concerted effort to leave Asia. This is Fukuzawa Yukichi's notion, Toa, leaving Asia, joining the Europe. In fact, one Japanese Minister of Education in the 20s, I guess, Mori, and he said, if England is now the paradigmatic example of the most advanced nation in the world, we Japanese should change our national language from Japanese to English. Later, he was assassinated. Well, not for that reason, but he was, but he did show that Westernization was identification with the West. So there was this very strong feeling on the part of Japan to try to become part of the West. And that march towards being integral part of the West was a national effort for many generations, ever since Fukuzawa Yukichi. And Japan has been very successful in doing that. In fact, Japan is one of the very few nations that managed to modernize, meaning globalize, and localize at the same time. There's a kind of a virtuous circle between the two. So the more they become modernized, the more become Japanese. And they're able to do that very successfully. And now they're part of the G7, so the mission accomplished. That whole process of trying to leave Asia. But Reischauer, as early as 1973, 74, posed a question. He said, look, Japanese exceptionalism may not be the way to look at Japan. We should look at Japan in a broader context of the cynical world, of not just China, but the Confucian world as a whole. And as early as 1974, he predicted, he first identified a number of basic values in the Japanese society, and then he predicted if these values actually contributed to Japan's strength as a major competitor of all the European societies, including America, then these 4 areas would develop. At the time, there were no terms like 4 mini dragons, 4 tigers. The area he identified turned out to be Taiwan, South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore. He then made the observation, which is even more bold, to me, very prophetic. The article, of course, is published in Foreign Affairs. You can make reference to that. And he said, now Vietnam is in terrible shape because of the Vietnam War. If the Vietnam War ever ended, Vietnam should be able to do the same, should be able to develop, because Vietnam also shares some of the basic cultural values. And he then said, the People's Republic of China, mainland China. If mainland China move out of the planned economy of the socialist system, mainland China could tap all these resources as well. Of course, he didn't say North Korea. We don't know. If we follow his argument that North Korea don't undermine that society, right now it's in a terrible shape. If there's ever a possibility of opening up North Korea, it could become a very important economic system as well. Now, anyway, I'm not a culturalist in the sense that I try to explain complicated economic political processes in cultural terms. I'm not a culturalist at all, even though Chalmers Johnson, a very good friend of mine, said he is an institutionalist, whereas Wei-Ming is always a culturalist. I'm not a culturalist in the sense that I want to use these cultural values to explain social political processes. Rather, my own methodology is very simple. If you can explain a phenomenon, like the Asian crisis now, in terms of pure economic features, like the banking system, like hedge fund problems, like international trade, the market mechanism. If you can explain these phenomena in economic terms without appealing to any other extra economic factors, I would be satisfied. You should do that. There's no need, and it's very important for you to get the statistic right, get the explanatory model right. But if you're not satisfied with the explanation, you feel that these are not just economic rules themselves cannot explain the phenomena. You really have to understand institutional features. You have to understand the roles of government. You have to understand whether the government is corrupt or not corrupt, whether the leadership is legitimate or not legitimate. Then you have to move beyond simply economic explanations to also institutional, I say, political explanations. That to me, and if you don't want to evoke any cultural factors or any values, to me that's fine too. If you're still not satisfied, you think there may be other reasons that need to be talked about. So in addition to economic, institutional, political, you also talk about some of the cultural values, like Reichau was trying to do. Then that's the area that I'm particularly interested in. So it's not a reductionist model. It's say, well, take culture more seriously than economics than politics. That's not right at all. You think you have to take the economic issues as economic issues. And the added values of the political explanation is not a substitute for economic explanation. And the added values of cultural values is not a substitute for political institutional explanations. So that's the context. So I'm not a reductionist in that sense, nor am I committed to the view, which is a Marxist view. If the economic situation changes, all other things, the superstructure will also change because the base structure changes. That's not that simple either. There's a continuous interaction. It's not possible for us to isolate the cultural factors from these other factors. It's very much an integral part of the whole process. You cannot talk about an institution without also taking into consideration of the values, particularly if you want to talk about institutions not just as physical structures, but as patterns of human interaction. And the minute you want to get in the human factor into the discussion, you cannot avoid value issues. It is in this context I would suggest that East Asian modernity, under the influence of Confucian tradition, suggests a model which is deeply under the influence of the West and yet significantly different. For lack of, for not clarity, but maybe for the purpose of discussion, I would like to point out 6 items about this particular model. The first one, government leadership in market economy is not only necessary, but is also considered desirable. The doctrine that government is a necessary evil and that the market in itself can provide an invisible hand for ordering society is antithetical to modern experience, either East or West, from this particular point of view. A government that is responsive to public needs, responsible for the welfare of the people, and accountable to society at large is vitally important for the creation and maintenance of order. So the first assumption about the East Asian model, or you can East Asian value orientation under the influence of Confucian culture, is the centrality of government leadership, even in economic matters. Now, many people say that's not true with one of those societies like Hong Kong. Well, Milton Friedman once made the remark, Hong Kong is laissez-faire par excellence. And I asked Hong Kong officials before 1997, these British Hong Kong officials, they said, no. What we try to practice is positive non-interference. The emphasis is on positive. The government is always there. The collaboration of the Hong Kong government, the British government, with the leaders of the Chinese merchants, and sometimes even some academicians, in terms of organizing various kinds of councils, very important. For example, more than 40%, maybe higher, 40% of Hong Kong residents live in government-constructed houses because Hong Kong is a refugee society. The government will have to do a lot in order to maintain the basic order of society. The government had to do a lot in order to maintain the market. And in fact, I don't know what year, maybe 87, when there was a collapse or the major situation in New York and then Tokyo, but Hong Kong market was closed for 3 days by order of the government. This is not laissez-faire in the classical economic sense. Now, so you have a total involvement of the government in the process, like the case of Singapore. You have guidance through MITI, like in Japan. You have advisory board by emphasizing the importance of the medium and small industries in Taiwan. You have a government collaborating with Major Chaebol in Korea. You have positive non-interference of Hong Kong, and of course China's case. And now if you look at Vietnam case, all these cases indicate the role of the government is very critical. And to have a good government is absolutely important. To provide the leadership of the government is absolutely important. The second feature is, although law is essential as the minimum requirement for social stability, organic social solidarity can only result from the implementation of humane rights of interaction. The rights is R-I-T-E-S, rituals. The civilized mode of conduct can never be communicated through coercion. Exemplary teaching as a standard of inspiration invites voluntary participation. Law alone cannot generate a sense of shame to guide civilized behavior. It is the ritual act that encourages people to live up to their own aspirations. So all these societies put a great deal of emphasis on ritual or propriety or civilized mode of conduct, even though it is very important for any of these societies to become truly modern to develop their legal structure. China is going through a major program of introducing the legal measures. But these societies are not legalistic, not litigious, certainly not as litigious as our society. Just one anecdote. There was a comparison earlier. It's no longer applicable now because the Japanese economic situation is horrible. When Japan economically was very vibrant, so a Japanese CEO was asked why Japan was able to do that. He said, well, you should look at two professions, law and engineer. In Japan, the ratio between engineers and lawyers is about 10 to 1, 10 engineers to 1 lawyer. In America, the ratio is just reversed, 10 lawyers to 1 engineer. We know that all the major engineering schools, from Stanford to MIT, to Caltech, UC Berkeley, overwhelming majority of the students are either foreigners or foreign students or Asian Americans. Whereas the brightest in American mainstream American society go into law. And just one example, which is a negative example, but it's very revealing. In 1995, when I was a guest of the United Nations to attend the social summit in Copenhagen, 3 major issues were discussed, important global issues. Social disintegration, poverty, and unemployment. And of course, I think Mrs. Clinton went and gave a keynote speech, and many heads of the states were there. The American press didn't even mention that social summit, let alone any kind of editorial discussion of these critical issues, because the mass media was obsessed with the trial of the century. Anything trivial from Los Angeles became headline. And we can see, we watch on TV day in, day out, how the lawyers function. And that kind of legalistic thinking actually was very detrimental to many of us trying to look at other dimensions of the society. Now, the third feature is quite obvious, and it's being talked about all the time. Family, as the basic unit of a society, is the locus from which the core values are transmitted. The dyadic relationship within the family, differentiated by age, gender, authority, status, and hierarchy, provide a richly textured natural environment for learning the proper way of being human. The principle of reciprocity as a two-way traffic of human interaction defines all forms of human relatedness in the family. Age and gender, potentially 2 of the most serious gaps in the primordial environment of the human habitat, are brought into a continuous flow of intimate sentiments of human care. This is, of course, a highly idealized description. I'm talking about aspiration. In actuality, the situation is very different. But there's the rhetoric and the argument for the importance of the family, not only as an important social unit for the stability of society. More importantly, it is the place where the basic values are transmitted. And they're often transmitted not through the father. In traditional Chinese society, often through the mother. Sometimes through the illiterate mother. Illiteracy is not a form of cultural unsophistication. We don't confuse literacy with cultural sophistication. We know that very sophisticated values can be transmitted through oral transmission, through exemplary teaching. The mother may not be able to recite classical poetry or to write classical poems, but she could transmit some of the basic values of the society just by acting accordingly. It's very, very important. It's important in Japan, it's important in China, it's important in Korea, it's important in Vietnam. Of course, it's important in America, in all societies. However, we are confronted with a new situation, of course, again, universal situation. In America, 5 channels are critical for the transmission of culture from one generation to the other. In the 60s, these 5 channels, in terms of descending order of importance, the family, church, school, peer group, and mass media. In the 80s, the church dropped. The school also dropped, below the peers and below perhaps mass media, but the family continued to be important. But in the 90s, the 3 major institutions for the transmission of values, family, church, school, all dropped down. And the 2 most important institutions turned out to be peers and mass media. The teenagers learn among themselves from each other. They learn from TV, and TV reflect what they want to learn. So that's the generational gap and other kind of problems we face. That's the reason that the question of value transformation, the question of the family, becomes even important in American political discussion now. The 4th point, civil society flourishes, not because it is an autonomous arena above the family and below the state. Its inner strength lies in its dynamic interplay between family and state. The image of the family as a microcosm of the state and the idea of the state as an enlargement of the family indicate that family stability is vitally important for the body politic. And a vitally important function of the state is to ensure organic solidarity of the family. Civil society provides a variety of mediating cultural institutions that allow the fruitful interaction between family and state. The dynamic interplay between the private and public enables the civil society to offer diverse and enriching resources for human flourishing. And one very basic assumption in the Confucian tradition is the relationship between the private and public is a dialectic, even dialogical relationship, which is a continuous process. For example, as an illustration, you can say, I am private, my family is public. But the family is private, the clan is public. The clan organization is private, the community as a whole is public. The community as a whole is private, the society at large is public. The society is private, the nation is public. But the nation is private, the international community is public. The international community, the whole human global community is private. The cosmos is public. So you can have a very strange kind, but I think important interplay between local and the globalizing process. My personal dignity is based upon my self-cultivation as a person. Therefore, to find the dignity of the person, I need to have some sense of who I am, self-identity. But that self-identity cannot be secure if I'm totally selfish. So how to make a distinction between selfishness and self-identity or dignity of the person is a major problem, a major issue in, say, in Confucian ethics. The family is the most enriching, most lovable, lovely environment, and caring, loving environment for human flourishing. But the family is also a place for the cultivation of nepotism. If we do not go beyond the family, we suffer from nepotism. If we do not become situated, rooted in the family, we will not have a sense of enrichment. Now, some people say Confucian ethics is family ethics par excellence. They cannot go beyond the family. This is to confuse Confucian ethics with mafia ethics. Now, if you move beyond the family, you have the parochialism. But at the same time, you have sense of communal participation. Don't confuse rooted in the community to become an engaged person in the community with the kind of parochialism. And that's true with patriotism. But patriotism is often diametrically opposed to chauvinistic nationalism or ethnocentrism, to feel extremely proud of being Chinese, for example. To take ethnic pride is not to say you necessarily suffer from ethnocentrism or chauvinistic culturalism. And even anthropocentrism, especially from the ecological point of view, anthropocentrism is a limitation. If we say we do everything for the human species, but we don't care about other animals, about trees and plants, eventually we suffer from lack of appreciation for culture, for biodiversity, we suffer ourselves. So anthropocentrism, from the Confucian humanistic point of view, is a limited form of anthropocentrism, which is not truly humanistic. So true humanism should go beyond anthropocentrism as well. So that interplay between the civil society in this case is all the space, the public space between the family and the state would be filled. Education ought to be the civil religion of society. The primary purpose of education is character building. Intent on the cultivation of the full person, schools should emphasize ethical as well as cognitive intelligence. Schools should teach the art of accumulating social capital through communication. In addition to the acquisition of knowledge and skills, schooling must be congenial to the development of cultural competence and appreciation of spiritual values. So education, if you want to find one particular arena that defines Confucian humanism, it is education. Learning to be human, 学做人. We are humans, but we learn to be human. It's a continuous process of the unfolding of the human project. And education in this sense is character building. I recently attended the 20th Congress of World Philosophy. More than 2,500 papers were presented. 4,000 people showed up, and in Boston. And the topic was Paideia for the first time. It's called education. The theme was philosophy educating humanity. So I asked to give one of the talks and focusing on this Confucian dimension, which is comparable to the Greek idea of know thyself, the Socratic method. And learning, this is the kind of wisdom which is rooted in Western civilization and of course rooted in Asian civilization that is being eroded in recent decades. Education as a way of learning to be human rather than simply as a method of acquisition of knowledge, to simply become useful members of society, hopefully to advance my career rather than to be able to reflect upon my own way of life. Philosophy as a way of life, as a spiritual exercise, is being relegated to the background. And finally, since self-cultivation is the root for the regulation of the family, governance of state, and peace under heaven, this is from the Confucian classic called The Great Learning, the quality of life of a particular society depends on the level of self-cultivation of its members. A society that encourages self-cultivation as a necessary condition for human flourishing is a society that cherishes value-oriented political leadership, mutual exhortation as a communal way of self-realization, the value of the family as the proper home for learning to be human, civility as the normal pattern of human interaction, and education as character building. Last November last year, I had an opportunity to visit George Mason University in Washington at the invitation of Professor James Buchanan. He was the Nobel laureate of 1976, noted for his commitment to classical economic theories. I gave a talk, he was one of my commentators. And later in the evening, we discussed some issues. He said, from the classical economic point of view, the most important value is freedom. But now I think there are two other values that need to be added to the idea of freedom. We need to train our young people not only to be free, but also to be responsible. And then he said, to be decent. So I said, that's not a classical economic idea. So why decent? He said, that's very simple. The ethical responsibility, we can all understand it. That is the hallmark for leadership. But decent, especially in a very vibrant global economy, the people, well, like us maybe, who are powerful, influential, have access to goods, information, and ideas, ought to be, the more they are powerful and influential, they ought to be more obligated or duty-bound to take care of the well-being of the society as a whole. Because the world is divided in such a way that those who are marginalized, those who are silenced, those who are in the periphery, not only do not have the means, if the leadership, not only they do not have the means, they do not have even the knowledge and the willingness to know what they deserve. If the leadership is based upon the market theory, this notion that human beings are rational animals, totally aware of their self-interest, committed to the maximization of their self-interest, or in the marketplace, adjudicated by law. If this is the idea of the human, if I do that freely, I don't need to express any sense of responsibility to anyone else. I don't need to be decent. And the social fabric will be eroded. Market economy is fine, but market society is disastrous. These values cannot be used for the maintenance of the social order, for human flourishing, for the development of an equitable form of life. Now, is it in this connection, we should probably get a chance to discuss many of these issues, that I feel that despite the financial crisis in Asia, if Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and mainland China, and eventually Vietnam to be sure, eventually even North Korea, if they're going to be able to recover from this crisis in the transitional period, the test to whether they will be able to continue to flourish and function according to some of these values that I just outlined is absolutely critical. Let me just give you one example as a conclusion for understanding the situation in China. Since the Opium War, China has suffered a great deal. All kinds of calamities, I would even say holocausts, happened in China. From the Opium War to the founding of the People's Republic in 1949, which was mid-1840s to 1949, every 10-year period, there was a major crisis. The Taiping Rebellion, 20 million people were replaced. 20 million people either died or became homeless. And the encroachment of Western imperialism, the Boxer Rebellion, and of course China was fighting against the united front of eight major nations, the warlord period, Japanese aggression, the international warfare between the nationalists and the communists. Even the case of 1905, when there was a Russo-Japanese war that fought on Chinese soil, the Chinese casualty was much higher than the Russian and Japanese soldiers combined, many, many times. So China suffered. And then since 49, every 5-year period, there was something dramatic. The Great Leap Forward, Cultural Revolution, and so forth. And in the period we call the period of great starvation, even the government now admitted probably over 20 million people died related to starvation, but the unofficial record was much higher, maybe 30 million or more. All these calamities happened in China. The Chinese neighbors were not affected by and large. The Asian Pacific region was not even aware what actually happened. You know, when more than 30 million Chinese died of starvation, and the industrial East Asia was taking off and not affected. Of course, the West was totally oblivious of what actually happened. But since '79, China has become an integral part of a global community. Now, the Chinese economy, 30% of the Chinese economy is international trade, global. And Chinese borders are open. The two-way relationship between Taiwan and mainland China involved billions and billions of investment, millions of tourists, even though they now begin to recognize each other in a possible resolution of the long situation. And China, there's no question about China is an integral part of this global community. And now with 100 million internal migration from the rural areas to the city, with a major flood that probably will cost significantly 1 point, even 2 point of the GNP. And with politicization, of course, democratization, pressure of democratization, with the need to join the WTO, all kinds of issues. What kind of cultural message China is going to convey? What kind of values the Chinese society ought to have? If China followed the social Darwinian model of hegemonic control, and I don't think it would be disastrous for China, be certainly disastrous for Asian Pacific region, for the stability of the world. Can China observe this idea of do not do to others what you will not others to do you? Can China rise above national interest? You see, for us now, our congressman, our president cannot say that our ideas are higher than simply national interest. National interest is the highest aspiration. If China or these other societies simply subscribe to national interest, the situation again would be very, very difficult. So it is in this context, I'm not arguing that Asian values, I'm not even involved in the Asian value discussion, but I think if the 6 points that are outlined as aspirations for East Asian societies under Confucian influence, and if any of these values are being relegated to background or pushed away, it would not only be a major threat to China's stability, but it will also a major threat to the rest of the world. It is in this context, I think the discussion of this value orientation is relevant, not simply an internal discussion of things Chinese, but related to even the question of global ethic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for that superb presentation. Most insightful. The floor is now open for your questions and comments. Please proceed.
Yes.
Very much enjoyed your wonderful speech. I have one comment and one question. Regarding Confucian values, I think my own experience might be heuristic. I'm currently a graduate student in the philosophy department of Rice, and I came from mainland China. In China, I thought Confucianism was nothing but backward and stupid things, all terrible ideas there. We should totally reject it at all. It has been only in this country I got the opportunity to really appreciate the cultural diversity, moral pluralism, and also got the real opportunity to learn Western philosophy and even Christianity better and more deeply, then I go back to reread the Confucian classics and analyze Confucius, and so I found, wow, there's really something really there significant and good that might be able to give me a meaning of my own life and so on. So I really found that's a really heuristic experience. I don't know what that be for other Chinese or East Asia people here, but that's my own experience. But my question is, as you know well, and your colleague, very famous philosopher John Rawls, argues that there are some very basic principles of justice that underlying any democracies. Maybe, if I understand him correctly, he might agree that maybe for some non-democratic societies, they can use some different principles. But his principles, he would say, from democratic societies. Any democracy must use his two, or accept his two principles as the basic things. And I'm very confused if that's the right case or not, and I would like to have your idea if that's correct. If, for example, I don't know if John Rawls would say maybe East Asia societies or nations have a little bit different democracies or modernization, but still the basic principles should be my two principles and cannot be different. What's your idea about that? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for two fascinating observations. Just a very quick reaction to your comment. I was born in Kunming, in China, but I grew up in Taiwan, 5th grade through college, then came to the States for graduate work. So the first time I returned to mainland for a month was 1978. Then I spent a year in Beijing studying at Peking Normal University in 1980. So in 1985, I was asked by Beijing University to give a course on Confucian philosophy. And I taught Confucian philosophy for that semester, which was a fascinating experience for me. You're absolutely right. Since the Cultural Revolution, everybody denounced Confucius. But I think in the last 10 years now, the situation has been dramatically changed. I just returned to a major conference in Shandong. In the last 5 years, about 200 books devoted to new Confucianism, which means Confucianism revitalized since the May 4th period. About more than 1,000 scholarly articles now. So this is now a new topic for further exploration. Now, I basically agree with your observation of John Rawls. You know, John Rawls' book on the theory of justice, and that was a classical study, perhaps one of the most important philosophical works in American philosophy for the last 2 decades. But John Rawls tries to combine Kantian philosophy with American pragmatism. So in this sense, he put a great deal of emphasis on the idea of justice as fairness, which is very compatible with the Confucian idea. I'll give you one example. When Confucius was asked, and how nice would it be if you can repay malice with kindness? Confucius said, how do you repay kindness? So his idea is repay malice with justice, repay kindness with kindness. Now that more differentiated way of human interaction becomes very, very critical for understanding nuanced understanding of Confucian humanism. So Rawls is trying to put a great deal of emphasis on overlapping consensus. And especially if you have a policy, you know, in the policy institute, if you have a policy which can, in a way, privilege the least advantaged, therefore it's not totally equitable in an abstract sense. It may turn out to be civic, may turn out to be useful for the society as a whole. Now recently, he decided to focus his attention on political liberalism. He's not saying that my theory is universally applied to all societies, but at least in our society, as a political liberalism, it works. But one argument I have with him is this clear, to me, unworkable distinction between the public and the private. He would consider any religious commitments idea as private, whereas the public arena should be an arena in which political policies are debated, not religion. I don't think that will work. It certainly won't work in Islamic countries or in many other countries. Probably won't work in America either. Because some of the things that we feel profoundly personal may not be private. Profoundly personal feelings can turn out to be publicly accountable for debate and argument. So I think we need to engage ourselves in those kind of debates. The old liberal idea of the clear separation between the public and private, I don't think it works. Yes.
Yes, you mentioned that one of the tenets of Confucianism was to have this government leadership that is accountable and responsible and responsive to needs of society. And I think that the leaders in Asia are that in terms of their government. But very often they invoke Asian values as an excuse for a lack of democracy in their societies.
Sure.
And this seems, they seem to be paternalistic, that they take care of needs of their own society, but the society really doesn't have a chance to define their own needs in a public manner. Right. So I wanted your comment on that.
Thank you very much. I think when I first was invited to Singapore, 1982, to take part in a joint venture to introduce some Confucian ideas to Singaporean society in 1982. And I was asked to give a lecture at the National University of Singapore, sponsored by the Chinese department. So my topic was the spirit of protest in Confucianism, 儒家的抗议精神. Now, if you look at a broad intellectual tradition like Confucianism, there are many dimensions. I think in the mass media, the focus is very much on political culture, and very much focused on a very narrow definition of political culture. That is what Li Guangyao and Mahathir talked about, Asian values. Therefore, the Western mass media is very skeptical. It is a kind of pretext for authoritarianism, for consensus. The notion is that, look, in our society, people should be obedient, sons are obedient to parents. And as people should take care of themselves, don't raise all kinds of questions, the freedom of speech, don't make all these noises. The intellectuals should be part of the political agenda, which to me is a very misreading of the Confucian project at all. If you look at the student protests in Tiananmen, if you look at the student protests in Korea or in Japan, and they're very much inspired by Confucian ideas, fighting against the corrupt government. The students are not simply voice their discontent in order to advance their own career. They represent the conscience of the people. That's a very, very critical element in the Confucian tradition. And the heaven sees as the people see, and heaven hears as the people hear. If the ruler cannot be accountable, the ruler should be removed. And to use Confucian ethics as a way of enhancing paternalistic concern, fighting against human rights, and talking about the Confucian idea of consensus formation as a demonstration of obedience, there's all abusive understanding, abusive use of the Confucian ideas. Now, if you look at many of these societies, of course, I'm not saying that the Confucian values cannot be abused. In fact, in traditional China, the emphasis on filial piety is linked to an emphasis on loyalty. If the children are filial at home, they will be loyal subjects. So that kind of politicization of Confucian values is being an important part of Chinese, traditional Chinese political culture. But that's only one segment of the whole tradition. The most important part of the Confucian tradition is what we know that the samurai bureaucrat in Korea, in Japan, the saling, or we call it the literati in Korea, and the scholars, especially the scholars who argued against corrupted power, fight against corrupted power in China. So that aspect of Confucianism ought to be underscored. And now the complexity is this. I recently discussed this issue in the context of American public policy. It's important for us to identify a new type of intellectual. I call them public intellectuals in American society today. Public intellectuals are those who are politically engaged, politically concerned, socially engaged, culturally sensitive and informed, and perhaps religiously musical. These are the people who are not only in the academic community, but also in mass media, in the government, in business, in social organizations, social movements, even in religion. We need an alliance of the public intellectuals to articulate major concerns of American society. And if we want to find a functional equivalent of a public intellectual in modern American society, that's the Confucian idea of the scholar. It's not a philosopher in the sense of an elitist. It's not a prophet. He's not that idea is not simply a guru or a priest. Not even the Russian idea of the intelligentsia, which is our sort of antecedent of the modern intellectual. So if you look at the Confucian tradition from that perspective, it is not only relevant, it is very important. It's important not only for American society, but for Singapore, for Malaysia, for East Asian societies as well. So that's where the real strength of that culture is. It is not simply the political ideology of being obedient, being non-reflective. You don't examine your life, you just follow the leaders. To give you one example about Singapore, I hope that the senior minister who comes will address that issue. Singapore in the last 2 or 3 years has decided that for Singapore to become even economically competitive, they need to emphasize creativity. Therefore, the slogan is thinking schools and learning nation. How can you have all the schools are thinking and the nation learning? You have to allow people to be able to express themselves. So the bottom-up process will be emphasized, not just the top-down. So this new generation of leaders are critically aware of that problem. So the old mode, I think Mahathir is, I'm really a friend of Anwar, so I've been criticizing Mahathir all the time. I just wrote an article in Chinese. I hope that will appear tomorrow. And Anwar represents a new leader, of course, rooted in the Islamic tradition, comparable to my idea of some of the younger scholars rooted in the Confucian humanism, which is very different from the old sort of dictatorial or paternalistic mode of leadership.
Thank you very much. And I have a rather simple question for you. Would you enlighten us about the modern part of the modern Confucianism? I guess you are probably the authority that knows this very well and it's close to your heart. But for most of us who sort of learned Confucianism in the 50s and 60s in Taiwan, we really would like to know what the modern or Xin Luxue, what the Xin stands for. What is new and over and above. And Wei-Ming兄, 你好.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, if you look at the Confucian tradition, as any of the major, we call it Axial Age civilizations in the world, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and so forth, Taoism, you can imagine it as a flowing stream rather than a static structure. And this flowing stream began in a tiny place called Qufu in the Shandong Peninsula. But over the period of about 3 or 4 centuries, it became a mainstream of Chinese thought toward the end of the Warring States, the beginning of the Han Dynasty. One thing that in that period that the Confucian tradition did, even the most cynical interpreters of the Confucian history will have to accept, that is, in addition to wealth and power, the Confucianists created a new space, a new arena That is, the people who are not necessarily the wealthiest, like the merchants, or powerful, like the politicians, could still exert profound and lasting influence in society. These were the educators. These are the people who educated society through exemplary teaching, very much like the Socratic method. So what the Confucians created for China for that period was an arena of value based upon education, moral self-transformation, not reducible to power on the one hand and wealth on the other. Then the Confucian tradition became the main ideology of China in the Han Dynasty, and also a very heavy price paid. Once you become powerful, you become influential, you also become corrupt. And that, of course, lasted for some period of time. And some of the leaders used Confucianism for the maintenance of their power. But then the Confucian tradition declined with the introduction of Buddhism and so forth. So for a very long period of time, the Confucian tradition was not the mainstream in Chinese thought. Buddhism and Taoism were. And then in the 11th century, roughly 11th century, the Confucian tradition resurfaced, reemerged, creatively responded to the challenges of Buddhism and Taoism. And in that period, the Confucian tradition flowed beyond Chinese borders to the Jurchens, the Mongols, and of course Korea, and Vietnam, and then to Japan. So some Japanese scholars, like Shimada Kenji, then characterized the Confucian tradition as a manifestation of East Asian spirituality. That's the reason now we talk about this whole area as the Confucian cultural universe. Because in China for about 800 years, in Korea 600 years, and Vietnam 600 years or more, Japan maybe 300 years, very much the bureaucracy, the basic education, the family, the social relationships are shaped by this Confucian tradition. Then with the impact of the West in the mid-19th century, the tradition declined again. And actually it declined so precipitously, especially critiqued by some of the most brilliant minds in East Asia, China in particular. China became anti-Confucian and believing that the only ideologies from outside, especially from the West, would be able to save China. Of course, Marxism was a good example of that. And this decline, some scholars like Levinson, called Confucian China and its Modern Fate, predicted as late as 1960, the end of Confucianism. He didn't believe there's any possibility of the revitalization of Confucianism. But the curious thing was just at the time everybody predicted the death, like Mark Twain, when he heard that, the news about his death, they said it's a bit exaggerated. So the pronouncement of the death of Confucianism was perhaps a little bit premature. A friend of mine, Guy Alito, when he published a book through UC Press on Liang Suming of the May 4th period, he called him the last Confucian. And then after the last Confucian, there are all kinds of other strange Confucians reemerged again. So then we're talking about the possibility, whether there's a possibility of a third epoch of Confucian humanism. This is the Xin, third epoch. That discussion began actually in the 70s. The Japanese Ministry of Education involved more than 100 scholars with a 10-year program to try to understand the Confucian tradition in Japan. Korea has never abandoned the Confucian tradition. And there was a survey done at East-West Center in 4 areas. Pudong area in Shanghai, and Seoul in Korea, Sendai in Japan, and also there's some work done in Taipei and in Hong Kong, the 5 places. And in the descending order of importance, Korea is the most Confucian of all these societies. Japan is second, and Hong Kong third, Taiwan fourth, mainland China the last. But that was about 15 years ago, and the situation changed very. Cultural change is much slower than political economic change, but culture always changes. So the situation is very different. My sense is that, say, 10 years from now, if you do the survey, then there will be different kind of configurations. And so in this sense, now there's no argument that, of course, still a lot of people consider Confucianism somehow irrelevant. Of course, people say all religions are irrelevant in the modern world. But increasing number of people begin to look for signs. What are the manifestations? So in our study of the Confucian traditions in East Asian modernity, I think we need to look at it, not just political culture. We need to look at how education, especially primary education was done, and family interactions, and a conception, worldviews, and basic patterns of human interaction. For example, how the business ethic was formulated. And both positively and negatively, we can confirm the relevance of the Confucian tradition. So when you have an Asian crisis, I should say one word about that. When you criticize cronyism, especially you criticize the relationship between government and the major companies like Triple in Korea. You criticize cronyism, criticizing corruption, and the lack of transparency, lack of institutionalization. Each one of the criticism is linked to the negative aspects of Confucian culture. You really have to understand the Confucian culture to appreciate how these values became disvalues in the society, how they function. But for Korea to reemerge, and cronyism may turn out to be, maybe overcome, a different kind of social interaction may become the norm, the Confucian value would still play a role. So it is relevant both in the negative sense and in the positive sense.
I think in a lot of us who still think positive about Confucianism, and there is a common feeling that Confucianism are very, very helpful and in self-developing and self-discipline. But when you apply that to a society or to nation or now to the world, there seems to be a feeling that Confucianism traditionally is a lack of emphasis on a objective judgment or rule, such as 法家. Would you care to comment on that? Or
sure. If you look at the cultural resources in China that can be mobilized for China's modern transformation, not just 法家, not just legalism, but the Maoist tradition with universal love, the Taoist tradition, and the folk traditions of various kinds, even the yin-yang tradition, the medical tradition, all kinds of traditions. But as a comprehensive humanistic tradition, Confucianism involves 4 dimensions, and they need to be integrated to understand the full texture of that tradition. One is the question of the self, then the dimension of community, then nature and heaven. There are 3 principles guiding these 4 dimensions. Continuous fruitful interaction between the self and community, but community variously understood as the family, as society, as nation, as the global community as a whole. Sustainable, harmonious relationship between human species as a whole and nature. There's a great deal of discussion, especially in the Neo-Confucian tradition. Zhang Zai's notion that heaven is my father and earth my mother, even such a small creature as I finds intimate relationship in their midst. All human beings are my brothers and sisters, and all things are my companions, and then developed a very elaborate notion about interconnectedness with everything, and yet differentiated. And then you have the question about the mutuality or mutual responsiveness between the human heart and mind and the weight of heaven. So you need to look at a very comprehensive humanism, especially when it's contrasted with the humanism that emerged in the modern West as a result of enlightenment. That humanism is very much of an anthropocentrism. Bacon's notion that in order to understand nature, you really have to rape nature. You have to subdue her, to force her to respond to your human desires. It's a very dramatic discussion. Objectification. Now, in the Confucian tradition, all the things are part of the communion of subjects. So maybe that's the reason Confucianism never developed the kind of scientific thinking. Traditionally, that's the case. But in the modern context, that vision of being integral part of nature does not necessarily impede sophisticated scientific investigation, but it will help us to develop a more harmonious relationship with the environment as a whole.
You can see that we could continue for another 2 hours. Please join me in thanking Dr. Wei-Ming.